Welcome to the Rational Egoist. I'm your host, Michael Liebowitz. Well, unless you're living under a rock, you're familiar with the recent showdown in Congress over FISA and I don't know what it is, an updating or reinitiating of it, something. They had to continue it for some reason. We'll get to that. But so I figured I'd get somebody on to talk about it. And today's guest can do that with some expertise. He's a senior fellow in Homeland Security and Civil Liberties at the Cato Institute, and he's also a former CIA analyst. Patrick Eddington, welcome to the program.
It's good to be with you.
So what exactly is FISA?
The acronym FISA in all caps stands for the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, which was originally passed in 1978 by Congress. This was done as part of a larger reform effort that had been underway since a number of surveillance-related scandals kind of broke, starting in 1971 and running all the way through 1975. And one of those scandals, of course, involved the Federal Bureau of Investigation and the National Security Agency engaging in various forms of essentially warrantless surveillance. Right under our Constitution, the Fourth Amendment is quite explicit. If the government wants to basically go after your papers, effects, and as far as I'm concerned, that includes both physical effects and digital effects in the age that we live in. They've got to have probable cause to do that, and they need to go to a judge and get a warrant in order to, go after you. And they've got to have probable cause to believe that you either have committed a crime or are about to commit a crime, et cetera, et cetera. So up until FISA's enactment, that's pretty much how things work. It's still how they work in kind of your traditional criminal court or, your standard Article 3 court kind of environment. But FISA changed the game in that what the authors of the bill wanted to do was still give our government the ability to catch spies. That was really a big driving factor behind FISA's enactment in 1978. It was to, ostensibly prevent the FBI and the NSA from going off the rails and spying on the rest of us who are not engaged in criminal activity or any kind of thing like that. But they still wanted the ability to capture communications that would indicate the efforts of, let's say, then Soviet agents or even now communist Chinese agents, all the rest of that, trying to recruit Americans to spy. And that's how it all started. And then we go, of course, to 9/11, and the entire game changes yet again. Just a few days after the attacks, Director Michael Hayden, he was the head of General Michael Hayden was the head of the National Security Agency at the time. He ordered his people to basically, turn on the switch, if you will, to capture all communications between the United States and Afghanistan. There were no restrictions that he placed on that whatsoever. So they were literally, vacuuming up any kind of communications traffic, looking for terrorists, ostensibly, terrorist communications. But it also meant that they were capturing U.S. person data as well. He did this in direct violation of the law. He did that in direct violation of FISA. He never went to jail for it. He's never even been charged for it, right? But anyway, they oftentimes use wartime emergencies to justify this kind of stuff. And that's exactly what happened. And so within 30 days of him doing that, roughly, he made sure that President Bush, George W. Bush, Bush 43, more colloquially, was aware that he was doing this, and Bush blessed it and began this process of essentially, every 45 days renewing it. President Bush had no constitutional authority whatsoever to do that. He should have been impeached for that, in my judgment. Anyway, none of this surfaces until December 2005, when the New York Times runs an extensive piece talking about this massive warrantless surveillance, which had gone way beyond, by this point, by 2005, gone way beyond just trying to pick up traffic between the United States and Afghanistan. It was vastly, vastly more expansive than that. And so once the New York Times ran that piece, we started on this 2.5-year odyssey of the Congress trying to make a essentially completely illegal program, at least nominally legal, passively legal, however you want to put it. And this is how we get in July 2008, the FISA Amendments Act. And this includes an entirely new title for FISA, Title VII. And this is where we get the FISA Section 702 program. And Michael, that's the one that you referenced kind of at the top. in terms of, this thing having to be renewed. When it was first passed in 2008, it was with an expiration date, essentially, about 5 years. It has been renewed now 3 times, essentially for kind of full duration coverage. But this time around, it was a little bit different because surveillance reformers had managed to basically dig up enough data on just exactly how abused this program has been over the last 15 years to get this current reauthorization set in only 2 years. So what does it all mean? What does it actually do, right? So this particular program now encompasses not only counter espionage, counterterrorism, it encompasses weapons of mass destruction type stuff. And also, and this is one of the new wrinkles, Representative Dan Crenshaw of Texas managed to get an amendment through the House that ultimately stuck in the bill that adds fentanyl and other kinds of narcotics, essentially, to what's a legitimate target under 702, right? So this is more securitizing of the drug war. This is more surveillance for the drug war, and so on and so forth. And then the other really scary thing that was added is they changed the definition of what constitutes a communications provider. For years, I mean, literally for years, going back to 1978, the definition of a communications provider was somebody like Verizon or AT&T, right? I mean, somebody who was a phone provider, and then when you get into the internet age, if they were also, offering essentially internet services, things of that nature. Well, they changed the language where it now encompasses almost anybody that would be operating any kind of, call it a pass-through, if you will, for other communications. And one of the pieces that I wrote, kind of calling this out, I said, and I just used, President Trump as an example. If he, was partial owner of a building in which essentially a communications relay kind of setup was operating, that was handling traffic for his businesses, maybe even handling traffic, for his legal defense team, all the rest of that. That's the kind of stuff that would potentially be, at risk. And, I use Mr. Trump as an example just because of his prominence and all the legal stuff that's going on with him right now and all the rest of that. But it would apply to any politician, regardless of political party. And it would basically applies to almost any of us. So this wraps up also, cloud service providers like Dropbox, Box, Sync, all those kinds of things, right? So it's a radical, totally unnecessary, quite frankly, expansion of the program. And it's almost certainly going to, ensnare more Americans. Now, before I shut up and give you a chance to actually get another question in edgewise, let me just say this. I am a former intelligence officer. I absolutely believe that it's critical for our government to be able to, utilize signals intelligence and this kind of communications intelligence and intercept capability to ferret out spies and potential terrorists and all the rest of that. But it can be done, and it should be done within the strict confines of the Fourth Amendment. And so what makes the 702 program so problematic is that when they go out and they sweep up all this data, it goes into a giant database, right? So it's data at rest. And the FBI, their agents get to go in and do these queries. And if they're using U.S. person search term queries like your telephone number or your name or anything like that, in a normal Article 3 court criminal kind of context, they would have to get a warrant to do that. They don't have to get a warrant right now. And we tried to fix that. Folks tried to fix that. The reformers tried to fix that, both in the House and the Senate. Speaker Johnson was the deciding vote that basically killed that attempt in the House. And that was really decisive, I think, in the struggle to try to actually reform this thing. So they still have the ability to go out and buy data from data brokers. If they can't get what they need from the existing 702 database, they can just, go to a data broker and say, hey, what do you got? And it's your taxpayer dollars and mine that are paying for them to spy on us, which kind of adds insult to injury. So that's essentially where we're at. That's what what the law actually looks like now.
Okay, now what you just said there about you believe that intelligence is vital to national security. It harkens for me back to James Madison and the Federalist in the famous "If Men Were Angels" passage, because he talked about how the thing to do is enable a government to have enough power to protect us while at the same time obligating it to hold itself in check. Now, judging from my social media feed, a lot of people are very wound up about this renewal of FISA and the lack of warrant requirements. But to me, it seems kind of irrelevant. And the reason is because you talked about how after 9/11, Michael Hayden started violating it anyways with Bush's endorsement. There were no consequences for them doing so. So,
Yeah.
what real difference does it make what they put in these laws if the government is not going to go by the law anyway?
You know, Michael, that is easily like the $64 million question. And by using that reference, I'm kind of showing my age, and I know that. But um, what you have just touched on is one of the prime frustrations that I and others who do this, kind of day in and day out have had for forever. And you're absolutely right that because there have been no consequences for this, um, they are able essentially to kind of get out there and just continue to do this. And one of the vulnerabilities, I mean, our system has a lot of vulnerabilities at this point. And when I say our system, I mean our governmental system, our structure of government. It has a lot of vulnerabilities that have essentially been revealed in very stark terms, I think, over the course of the last 100 years, and especially in the last 20. And one of those is the fact that when you have an entity like the Office of Legal Counsel over at the Department of Justice, which OLC basically writes the opinions that tells DOJ personnel and FBI personnel and DEA and ATF personnel what is considered legal or permissible and what is not. And that basically serves as cover, like serves as legal cover for them to go out and do these kinds of things, essentially, even when they wind up getting caught. And I think one of the greatest frustrations I ever had was when Mr. Obama took office, and we had all these revelations, of course, come out about the U.S. torture program that was run by my former employer, the Central Intelligence Agency, during the Bush 43 administration. And, when Obama was kind of pressed on this stuff, he said, well, we need to look forward, not backwards. Well, nobody was held accountable. I mean, literally, people died in CIA custody, and nobody went to jail. When John Brennan was Mr. Obama's head of the CIA, and this whole torture investigation was underway by the Senate Intelligence Committee, being led by his fellow Democrat, the late Senator Dianne Feinstein. John Brennan authorized CIA personnel to literally hack into the computer that was being used by Senate investigators who were looking at the CIA's torture program. And there were no consequences for that, right? So we could literally spend an entire podcast just talking about, these kinds of examples. But you've absolutely put your finger on one of the fundamental problems that we have, and that is there's no accountability. And I will tell you that one of the most important publications that the Cato Institute has ever put out, as far as I'm concerned, is a study that our senior vice president for criminal justice studies, Clark Neely, did initially in 2019, and then updated in 2021. And what Clark did is he took a look at the composition of the federal bench in terms of the background of the people who wind up getting nominated to fill, judicial positions, including all the way up to the Supreme Court. And what he found, this really kind of blew my mind, but when I realized the magnitude of it, it really helped to explain a lot of stuff. People who get nominated to the bench who have a prior executive branch legal background, so somebody who was a U.S. attorney, somebody who was an assistant attorney general, somebody who was maybe in the Solicitor General's office at the Department of Justice, people like that. Those kinds of people tend to get nominated and confirmed to the federal bench over people like Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, who is a former public defender, right? The government advocates or former government advocates, that's how we tend to refer to them. They get nominated and confirmed to the federal bench anywhere from 10-1 to 12-1 compared to folks like KBJ. So is it any wonder that when you have the federal judiciary essentially populated with former executive branch advocates, when these kinds of questions on national security related law and where they impact your rights and my rights and the rights of your listeners come up, if it's even a tie, it goes to the government, right? And that's the problem. There's no sustained accountability. Absolutely none. And unless and until we get a fundamental change in how we approach the judicial nomination process, first and foremost. And then secondly, unless and until, we get people on these House and Senate Intelligence Committees who are actual overseers instead of water carriers for the Intelligence Committee. I mean, that's the other perversion that's happened since 1978. At the beginning of our talk, I discussed the fact that in 1978, there were a series of reform measures that were put in place to try to deal with all these FBI and CIA and even military intelligence um, overreaches and constitutional rights violations from the 60s and 70s. And one of the reforms was the creation of the House and Senate Intelligence Committees. And when the late Senator Frank Church of Idaho, the Democrat, and Senator John Tower, Republican of Texas, were the chair and the vice chair, respectively, of what was known as the Church Committee. They were very aggressive, in pursuing this kind of stuff, and trying to basically, put some firewalls in place. But what has happened over the last 35 to 40 years, is that the House and Senate Intelligence Committees have tended to populate their staffs with people who were career CIA or career FBI or career NSA people, right? And most of the time, the leadership in the House and Senate has put people on those two committees who have tended to be very pro national security state, right? So you get a warping of the federal judiciary in favor of executive branch power. And then the principal oversight committees, at least for the intelligence community, are likewise warped, essentially, with a pro-surveillance state, pro-national security state bias. And it's bipartisan. It's absolutely bipartisan. Is it any wonder that these programs are out of control and that nobody's ever held accountable for them? No, I don't think it's any shock at all. So you need a real political revolution, in this area, and you need a lot more people, on both sides of the aisle who are committed to it. I mean, one of the bright spots about this latest FISA fight was seeing these guys in the House Freedom Caucus teaming up with, super progressives like Zoe Lofgren of California to offer a really great bill that passed out of the Judiciary Committee in December 2023, 35-2, 35-2. You don't see that on Capitol Hill. So the people that actually know the law and understand the implications of this from a constitutional standpoint on a bipartisan basis on the House Judiciary Committee were completely appalled at what was going on. And they were almost totally united in trying to fight it. But the forces of the national security state have enormous allies. They have enormous power. I usually don't, like the term deep state, because I think it implies a level of competence on right. That's really what it does imply. It imply and there's not, trust me, there's not competence there. I mean, when they are engaging in phishing expeditions in the 702 database and they're running this against 19,000 donors to a House member, right? I mean, actual money donors to a congressional candidate, right? That's not competence, right?
No.
And when they're engaged in in looking at all manner of domestic protesters that represent absolutely no threat to the political order, they represent no real public safety threat. That's incompetence, right? In addition to being wrong constitutionally, right? So it's a mess. I mean, I hate being like, such a Dougie Downer or whatever, but
It's hard not to be.
it is very hard not to be, and it's very hard not to be incredibly angry about this pretty much day in and day out, because the longer, and I know that you understand this, Michael, the longer that this goes on, the further away we get from the vision of the founders of a functioning republic, right? That is what's happening to America. And we've got to find a way to change it. It's just that simple.
See, to me, like people say that a lot. We're losing the country. I hear our freedoms are going away. To me, it's done. I mean, we could get it back, but the idea that we're in any sense living in a constitutional republic as envisioned by the founders is silly. I mean, the welfare state alone, the war on drugs, it's done. So when people say that, like I hear it all the time, we've got to elect so-and-so because we're losing our democracy or we're losing our freedoms. It's just really, we're just losing them now. You
Yeah.
mentioned the deep state, and one of the things that drives me absolutely batty about conspiracy theorists is they grant a level of competence that just isn't warranted, some credit that's not warranted.
Amen.
While I was incarcerated and people were getting infected with COVID, and guys would say, I think they're doing this on purpose. They want us to get sick. And I'm just like, these people can't even figure out the rec schedule. And you think that they're coming up with these vast plans. I think it's Napoleon who said, never ascribe to malice what can be, never ascribe to malice what can be explained by incompetence. And I think that's
Yeah.
absolutely correct.
Yeah.
But, intuitively, I agree with what you said before. We need to have intelligence agencies. We need to have something that's, designed to keep us safe. That's my intuition. But logically, it gets harder and harder for me to defend that. And here's why. You mentioned we need sort of a revolution, a political revolution, right? Now, in order for that to happen, the bulk of Americans need to be aware of what's going on in their government. They need to understand it, and they need to understand why it's bad. When you went through all that stuff, I got dizzy. Like I can't even. I get to the point I don't even know what you're talking about. I mean, we've got the NSA, the CIA, the
Yeah.
FBI, the DOJ,
Yeah.
a bicameral legislature, three branches of government, military intelligence, and buried in all of those, you've got all these attorneys and all these judges that are in agents and this. Like, how do people become aware of this? I mean, it's easy to say, okay, they're trying to renew 702, and there needs to be a warrant requirement. Okay, fine. But then you get into all the violations that take place anyways, even with
Hmm.
it, there's just so much information. How can the public possibly understand that unless we actually get rid of the administrative state, we get rid of these agencies? And that might be dangerous. I grant you that. But can it possibly be worse than what we have?
You know that that's a tough one. Um, I would say that, and I know you know this too. Once a federal agency or department gets established, it is almost impossible, and usually is impossible, to actually get rid of it. And it can even be something that is even just tangentially related to national security. And I'll give you just one very quick example. There's this entity called the Maritime Administration, and there is a law that they get to enforce. It's known as the Jones Act. And this was passed basically in the World War I era, to kind of give you a sense of how long this thing has been around, right?
That's a shipping law. It has to do with shipping, right?
Yes,
Okay.
and it's not like completely in my bailiwick, but because I run Cato's Freedom of Information Act program, I've helped my colleague Colin Grabo, who does work the issue, get a lot of data out, on this particular program, and what they're doing essentially behind the scenes to try to prevent the law, the Jones Act, from being repealed. And when this thing was passed, over 100 years ago at this point, it mandated essentially that any kind of cargo that was going to be moved between U.S. ports had to go on a U.S. flagged, U.S. crewed ship. Well, 100 years ago, the American merchant marine was pretty huge. It has declined radically over the last 100 years. Most cargo that comes to this country or leaves this country goes on, foreign flagged vessels. I mean, that's just, how the world has essentially evolved in terms of the shipping industry. But there are certain special interests in this country that benefit from the Jones Act. Shocking. I know that's going to be very shocking to hear.
It is, yes. There's
Um,
evidently there's gambling in Casablanca too, from what I understand.
and so, the folks that, want to keep this insane law on the books, um, they spend a lot of time doing it. And so there have been efforts, to try to defund the Maritime Administration. There have been efforts to basically try to, make the law go away and all the rest of that. But this relatively small, select special interest has managed to kind of block it. Now, I use that small, relatively easy to understand example to kind of set the table for this larger problem that you put your finger on, which is the size of the federal national security state, right? All these multi-letter agencies, There are 17 different intelligence community components, by the way, at the national level, right? Just alone, right? And you've got multiple federal law enforcement agencies as well that are there. So it is absolutely a giant challenge to try to get people, to understand that this state exists and that the only, at least short to medium term solution is to try to find ways to put some real limits on what they can actually do. And so, we had this whole FISA fight, and we came closer probably this time than we have, in the previous two iterations of actually getting the kinds of things that we were looking for. But it's going to take, some additional changes in the political dynamic to kind of make that happen. But, this public education campaign, the need for it, that you put your finger on, that's something that I try to address every day with what I do in my writing. And in about 10 months, I'll have my first book out on this particular topic. It's called The Triumph of Fear: Domestic Surveillance and Political Repression from McKinley through Eisenhower. The last chapter, the epilogue, will cover some of the things that we've actually been talking about on this podcast, the more contemporary stuff. But I think it's important for folks to kind of understand the history of how we got here, and to understand essentially, the level of difficulty, that we face. But there's absolutely no substitute, for public engagement. And I do believe, I mean, public polling does show that people are very concerned about this issue. They're concerned about their privacy. They're concerned about the security of their data, the privacy of their data, and all the rest of that. And it's both in the context of commercial data brokers, right, but also in the governmental context. And I think, if we can find a way to successfully mobilize enough people to directly express, if you will, their concerns to their members of Congress, and to make it clear that this is the kind of thing that will determine, their choices every 2 years and every 4 years, then we have at least a chance of making some progress. But I'm completely with you in terms of the magnitude of the problem. It's epic. It's absolutely epic. It cannot be, should not be ever underestimated.
Now, everybody, I think, is familiar with the name Edward Snowden. Was what he revealed or exposed, did that have anything to do with FISA, or anything to do with limitations under FISA?
So in essence, his revelations had a direct impact on a separate law, the Patriot Act,
Oh my
the
God.
and specifically the section 215 telephone metadata program. That was like that massive order from the government to Verizon to turn over, just like millions and millions of pieces of data on anybody who was using the Verizon service. That was like, I think, the very first story in The Guardian on June 6, 2013. That's the one that kind of got it going. That was before Snowden actually, outed himself as being the individual responsible for, putting all that stuff in play. Um, and it's interesting because what we subsequently learned, and this was literally like years later, is that his revelations caused the Drug Enforcement Administration to shut down a similar program that they had been running since 1992. Right. And it's
So
interesting.
what were they doing? I don't mean to I do mean to interrupt. I hate when people, I don't mean it. Obviously, I
Yeah,
meant it. I
yeah,
did it.
yeah.
But were they doing in both cases that you're in with the DEA and in the case of what Snowden revealed?
So I'll talk about the NSA program that Snowden basically kind of outed in a moment. But let's go back to the DEA program,
Okay.
because that I think is what inspired, unfortunately, a lot of what the NSA wound up doing. So this won't shock you, as part of the war on drugs, um, DEA began a series of programs. It's three programs that we know of. We know the code name for one of them, USTO, was the code name for one of them. And it involved essentially going to the telecommunications providers and saying, we want the data on, these specific phone numbers. And in some cases, it was lots and lots of phone numbers that they were looking for. And they were basically trying to track communications between the United States and a number of countries and individuals and entities in Central and South America. So this was all about the drug trade, I mean, and across the board, it appears to be the case. I mean, not just cocaine, but a lot of other stuff as well. And one of the programs that they were also running, from what I can tell, we know most all of this because of a Department of Justice Inspector General investigation that was made public in 2019. The full unredacted report by the DOJ IG, however, was not made public until we at the Cato Institute sued. Well, we filed a FOIA to get it out. It took a while, but we got that one out. So long story short is this. In addition to going to AT&T, Verizon, et cetera, and asking for the kind of stuff I've already talked about, they appear also to have been going around to any, establishment, and this happened heavily in the Chicago area from what we can tell, looking for anybody who was basically making mass purchases of burner phones, right? So they wanted all burner phone purchase data. And here's what's ironic about it. When they tried to bring the FBI into this program, the FBI agents who were brought into it took a look at it and said, we don't think that this is actually lawful, which I thought was really kind of funny, given how the FBI tends to really kind of go off the deep end. But the fact that these agents thought that the existing DEA programs were like way over the line was very telling. And even some of the attorneys within the DEA, expressed real concern about the fundamental legality of it. And if a telecom provider refused to provide data to the DEA, even after they had been given an administrative subpoena as kind of legal cover, to make it ostensibly legal, DEA made the decision not to go into court because they didn't want to reveal the program. Well, they didn't want to reveal the program because if they'd had to go into court, the court probably would have found it to be unconstitutional, right? So that just kind of goes back to, your larger question about the integrity or lack of integrity, in the oversight process. And those oversight processes that are internal to these agencies and departments, which I think more often than not is an oxymoron, right? And the external oversight mechanisms that are actually supposed to, kick in and be, observant for this kind of stuff. And we find that too often they just aren't, right? So, but that is it was another benefit essentially of Snowden's revelations, is that, he got DEA, he didn't know it probably at the time, but he got DEA to shut that down. Now, the NSA program was basically very similar, but it was much less discriminate. I mean, they were going for all manner of communications essentially. And again, this is all, allegedly counterterrorism related. Now, the thing that I'll tell you as a former intelligence officer is this. If you want to actually really nail a target, you don't use mass surveillance to do it, right? You're supposed to be going after, one specific entity, or if it's in a military context, you're trying to essentially understand a command and control arrangement, whether it's a ground-based military unit or whether it is, a naval task force or something like that, right? But it's got to be specific to be effective, because what you want to be able to do, especially in a wartime environment, is you want to be able to put steel on target. You need to actually go after the right one. But these programs, I think in a lot of respects, they have kind of become self-perpetuating because of the bureaucratic incentives that exist in these agencies, right? So if you take a step back and you think about, what do FBI agents, for example, what do they get rated on? Well, how many assessments did they open? How many preliminary investigations did they open? How many full field investigations? How many enterprise level investigations? How many people did they actually manage to turn into confidential human sources? And how many cases were they involved in where there was a plea deal or a conviction, right? And then for your U.S. attorneys, same deal. How many cases did they open? How many plea deals did they manage to get? If they went to trial, what was their batting average? How many times did they win? So there's an incentive structure built into our law enforcement and our intelligence infrastructure that supports it, that to me incentivizes this kind of stuff. It's not about taking a look at the data and saying, okay, there's just no way this guy or gal was not involved in this bad thing, right? So let's just move on and keep going. It's how do you find a way essentially to try to get the conviction or get the plea deal or whatever, and what data can you use essentially to do it? And I just think the incentive structures they're perverse and they help to drive this stuff.
Okay, so as if this stuff couldn't get any worse, we have Jim Himes, who co-authored an amendment. He's a congressman from my state where I live, Connecticut, and they submitted this amendment, and it's been called the Stasi Amendment. So, what's in this amendment, and why is it called this, or why did somebody call it the Stasi Amendment? I shouldn't make it sound like that's what they called it. Like they didn't submit it and say this is here's our Stasi Amendment.
No, and in fact, it was my friend Sean Vicka, the policy director at Demand Progress, that actually tweeted that statement directly at Himes on X, formerly Twitter. And I kind of mentioned that amendment a little bit earlier. And what it did is it literally changed the definition of a communications provider and broadened it, right? So that's how you get, cloud storage type outfits like Dropbox and Box and Sync and all the rest of those, among other kinds of entities that handle communications or data in some fashion. So think of it, going way outside of just like Verizon now or AT&T or whatever. Now you're roping in a whole larger universe, essentially, of the digital world that you and I and everybody else who's listening to this podcast basically relies on at this point. And this was, literally kind of slid in at the last minute as part of this brokered deal that Speaker Mike Johnson in the House had kind of put together. And it didn't initially get a lot of attention until late December. And then Marcus Wellinger, who's an attorney here in Washington, who has a practice, he is a former Department of Justice lawyer. And two of his partners that I know of are former Department of Justice lawyers who have been involved in FISA cases, right? And actually had to defend DOJ when they worked at DOJ in front of the FISA court on applications. And these guys came out in December and then again in April, I think April 9th, with this blog post that was just blistering saying, this is garbage. This is going to be terrible. This is going to sweep in a huge number of additional people. The authors of the amendment, Himes, and then the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mark Turner, Republican of Ohio. They just said flat out that these guys were being completely disingenuous about what the amendment would ultimately do and the kind of effects that it would have. And for those guys, the former DOJ guys who actually really understand this stuff at a granular level to come out and write those things, they weren't the only ones, but they were among easily the most credible critics to come out and just blast this entire thing. And so it put Himes on the defensive. And it put the others. And there were efforts, valiant efforts to try to strip this thing out, both in the House side and the Senate side. But unfortunately, they were defeated. And on the Senate side, I'll say this: it was really clear to me, and it's probably clear to a number of observers who are like following this stuff, that Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer really let Senate Intelligence Committee Chairman Mark Warner of Virginia, my home state, run the show when it came to FISA. So Senator Dick Durbin of Illinois, who is the actual chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, really did not have, even though the judiciary committees in the House and Senate have primary jurisdiction over FISA, it was the intelligence committees essentially that kind of ran the show with the acquiescence, if not the outright support, of the leadership in the House and the Senate. And so that's how we get this utterly atrocious outcome. And like I said, to the extent that there's a silver lining in this, it's only for 2 years. And then essentially we see where we're at. I mean, and to be fair, the Department of Justice Inspector General is under this bill charged with doing a very detailed analysis of how well or how poorly this law is working, particularly in terms of whether or not it protects people's rights. And that report has to come out about 6 months before the expiration of this law in 2026.
So what can you, it's going to be tough, I know. Can you summarize the final bill that was signed into law by President Biden, I think on April 20th?
Yeah. So it extends the FISA Section 702 program for 2 years. So this takes us into April of 2026. It allows the FBI and the NSA to continue to buy data from data brokers without a warrant. It allows them to continue to search the FISA Section 702 database of stored communications of Americans without a warrant. It now gives them also the ability to rope in essentially the drop boxes and sinks and other kinds of entities of the world as part of this collection program. And it does actually include some criminal penalties for violations with respect to these searches, but they have to be, quote, willful violations. So what does that mean? It means that if FBI agents accidentally query, I don't know how you accidentally query, but anyway, if they accidentally query, or if they don't do it with a willful intent, et cetera, they're going to probably be able to evade prosecution. The simpler way to have dealt with this, of course, would have been to have a warrant requirement where they would have had to justify it before a federal judge. But we didn't get that, unfortunately. So it does represent a radical expansion of FISA, of its reach. It continues a lot of absolutely problematic policies and capabilities that directly impact and put at risk, the rights of Americans. There's just no other way to kind of put it.
Now, Mike Johnson, the Speaker of the House, formerly had a different position on this, the renewal, with the warrantless searches. And then he claims, or it's claimed, that he saw intelligence, and once he saw the actual dangers or whatever the hell he saw that nobody else can see, or none of us peons can see, he had a change of heart. As a former intelligence analyst, is there anything to that? Is he seeing things that nobody else, no civilians are seeing, that would justify changing his position in supporting this bill?
Well, to be fair, I wasn't in the room. I did not, I was never present, and I don't know that, there was that much in the way of staff present or anything like that. So when you walk into a room like that and you give a one-sided presentation and there's no adversarial process, right? Then
Oh,
then
okay.
then it makes it, much easier essentially for them to kind of, buffalo a member or more than one member. And Mike Turner tried this, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. He badly wanted to have a completely secret session for all House members. That was defeated. He had to back off of that. So anytime the intelligence and law enforcement agencies at the federal level insist that something has to be done in secret, and that if members just saw what they saw, they would understand why they have to violate the Fourth Amendment. Anytime you see that going on, that's an automatic red flag, because we know on the basis of previous examples, and that Patriot Act Section 215 telephone metadata program that Edward Snowden basically surfaced in terms of how NSA was violating it. For years and years and years and years, the American public was told that program was vital to national security. If we don't have this, people will die, yada, yada, yada. And when they finally shut it down in 2018, they had to admit, no, it never stopped a single attack on the country. And the same thing was true for the original Stellar Wind program. That's the warrantless surveillance program that Hayden started immediately after 9/11, right? That got us to where we are today. And when the combined inspectors general of the intelligence and law enforcement community took a look at the Stellar Wind program, and this was in 2009, and we didn't learn this until 2015, because it was then that the New York Times managed to surface these reports through Freedom of Information Act litigation. It's the only way we found out about it. When those reports in 2009 were put together, they found that the Stellar Wind program never stopped a single attack on America, right? Mass surveillance doesn't stop attacks. Mass surveillance makes bureaucrats in the law enforcement intelligence community, it makes them feel more comfortable being able to say when an attack occurs that they missed because they weren't focused. Well, we did everything we could with the data we had, yada, yada, yada. But that's not how 9/11 happened, right? I mean, 9/11 happened because they had the data and they didn't share it. They didn't play nicely with each other. And that's why almost 3,000 people died that day, right? And that's not my opinion. That's what the Congressional Joint Inquiry found in 2002. And 2 years later, the 9/11 Commission put an exclamation point on those findings with everything they did. So that's the other thing that just sends my blood pressure through the roof, every time I deal with this stuff, is that their incompetence, the incompetence of the intelligence and law enforcement community at the federal level is why people die. It's not that they don't have the data. They had the data. They did not play nicely together. And that's why people died. And so they shouldn't be rewarded for not playing nicely together by giving them even more expansive powers, where they will almost invariably fail to actually, like, really actually catch a genuine bad actor about to do something terrible. It is maddening. It is maddening. There is a reason that I gained some weight, during the pandemic, because I had to discover scotch and some other things in order to self-medicate, through all this stuff, because it's just it's not what James Madison had in mind. That's for sure.
Absolutely. All right, Patrick, before we wrap up, is there anything we didn't cover that you think we should have?
No, I think we've probably given our listeners enough reason to go and drink as well this time around.
There's going to be an epidemic of scotch drinkers coming out. All right. Well, where can people find you in the work that you do?
At the Cato website, if you just Google literally Cato Institute, Patrick Eddington, it will take you directly to my bio page, which has literally everything there that I have done, whether it's been a podcast, an op-ed, a blog post, whatever, it's all there. I'd encourage your listeners to take a look at, the work that all of my colleagues here at Cato do. We're doing everything that we can for our part, to advance a more liberty-centric America, whether it's in the economic arena or the national security arena or law enforcement arena. So I just encourage everybody to go there. But yeah, if you just Google Patrick Eddington, Cato Institute, you'll come right to my page.
All right, Patrick, thank you so much for this enlightening discussion. Really
My
appreciate it.
My pleasure to be with you.
For now, this is the Rational Egoist signing out. I'm Michael Liebowitz. Till next time.